relevant, reliable, and researched. This is Experts on Call, the show focused on delivering leading-edge news and information on today's most beneficial products and services. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.
Just the two of us. We can make it if we try. Just the two of us. Just the two of us. Just the two of us.
And welcome back to Quay Pacific's Talk About Strata. I'm Sterling Fox. My co-host and musical director is Tony Giventu, Executive Director of the Condominium Homeowners Association of British Columbia. Our guest is Paul Mendez from L'Esperance Mendez, the law firm in downtown Vancouver. Paul is a Strata lawyer. And Tony, you chose that particular wonderful tune because of the disputes that are the subject of this conversation, or what? You have a gleam in your eye. What I'm trying to discern what that means. You had a reason for Grover Washington Jr.
Absolutely, though. Really, everything about these disputes requires the motivation of both of the parties to find a solution. You know, and if one of the parties in the wrong, come to it quickly rather than squander everybody's resources to try and fight it. Mm-hmm. You know, it's just about the cooperation of the parties to be able to find quick resolutions to some of the disputes that are out there.
Okay, now Paul, in our last segment, we talked about the Strata owners, plural, where a pipe had burst and the Strata Council had decided not to activate their insurance claim and get this thing fixed and cleaned up and professionally tuned up and made right quickly. They decided they were going to do it themselves, hired somebody to come in and do a substandard job, and these people are out all sorts of dough. 6 months after the pipe burst, they're still not repaired, and they're angry. So, and then you talked about, one of the dangers of not doing a professional cleanup job, especially when water escape is concerned, is mold. If you don't dry it out and clean it up properly, you're just asking for trouble. And so another email example that Tony's brought along with us for your consideration, Counselor, a townhouse development. 4 of 66 units, Paul, have mold in their attics, which is common property. The Strata Corporation has advised each of those 4 owners it's their responsibility, and the Strata Corporation will not do the repairs. Each owner then removes the insulation and discovers missing vent leaks, causing the dryer exhaust to go directly into the attic space. Aha! So, who's responsible for this defect? Who's responsible for common property? What options do those 4 mold-owning owners have if the Strata doesn't reimburse them for those repairs? Kind of a complex thing, Paul, but you see this every day in your practice. What do you, at first blush, I saw a couple of things just reading this that kind of struck me as being odd. What's your take on it, just the first reading?
Well, the good news is only 4 out of 66 that have the mold. So
I suppose so.
I would view that as a silver lining in that problem.
Absolutely.
That's a lot better than 66 having mold.
Sure.
This is actually, this type of problem highlights one of the difficulties that lay people have understanding how common property and strata lot property works in a townhouse setting. Because it's a townhouse, people tend to assume that certain areas that are common property, such as attics and crawl spaces that can be common property, are actually the owner's responsibility. And so this is a strata where the council has adopted that approach. In a situation where common property has damage to it, or there is a defect in common property, and the defect here obviously is these vents, which are not properly connected and are exhausting moist, warm air into the attics. Those would fall under the strata's responsibility clearly under Section 72. And I would expect, again, in this scenario, a letter would probably resolve this, because what I find typically is when the owner gets a lawyer, strata will get a lawyer, and assuming the lawyer who's written the demand letter has correctly analyzed the problem from a legal point of view, the strata's lawyer is likely to come to the same conclusion.
Aha.
And then, and if the strata follows that path, I would expect it to be resolved. That's not to say that they always do that. In some cases, there are some people on councils who view themselves as experts in the law far better than any lawyer, and they may, notwithstanding receiving a letter from a lawyer on this issue, continue to maintain that the attics are to be repaired by the owners.
Tony, you travel all over British Columbia advising strata councils and individual owners all the time. How frequently do you come across strata councils that simply get the law wrong and say, no, we're not responsible for that? And Paul says, just a second, look it up. You are so. Is that more common than not?
It's more common than ever, actually, because there's all kinds of blog sites that people go to now where there's just general random opinions. And general information is great. The problem is no two strata corporations are the same. They all have different designations of property, different allocations, agreements, use, bylaws. The structure of the strata is different. Everything's different about all properties.
Right.
So you have to be extremely careful with generic information. That's the first part of the problem. One of the other sides of this, though, is buildings are complicated structures.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're talking about 66 different individual units, 66 different ventilation systems, and all of these things, there are bound to be some omissions, some defects in the building system. Those are normal. Where we find that strata corporations really fall down is that they fail within the first 2-year cycle or 5-year cycle to hire someone to inspect their building systems closely to make sure everything's performing. Right? We have a very good warranty system in British Columbia. The only way that warranty system works for us as consumers, though, is we have to make it work and we have to protect it. The warranty system is basically worth $100,000 a unit and $2.5 million per building for a strata. So when you think about that value, isn't it worth a small amount of money before the 2-year window and the 5-year window to have your building closely inspected to make sure the whole building is working? Now, we don't know whether this is a new development or not.
Right.
But I suspect that they've discovered mold, they've discovered a building defect. I would suspect this is a relatively new building by looking at this email, that this is something that's happened. The flip side of it is, here we are dealing with all kinds of volunteers who think they know better, right? Mm-hmm. So let's say that the Strata Council goes in and says, you know what, you're right, that we'll get this fixed. So they hire somebody to fix the venting problem, but what about all the mold contamination?
That's right.
Right? Like
yeah.
there's an environmental problem here now,
yeah.
which is going to have long-term health effects on the occupants of those units. So is someone actually treating the mold in the wood structure? Does the wood structure have to be replaced?
Yes.
Does the insulation have to be pulled out? We've actually had some buildings where this has occurred in the Lower Mainland, where the roofing system had to be completely removed, including roofing, decking, and trusses on 2 of the units because the mold had contaminated everything so badly.
Wow.
Right? And it's just because a dryer vent didn't have a connecting pipe to the outside, just exhausted into the attic space.
As was the case in these 4 townhouses in which we've seen mold. Now, Paul, the last of the several rapid-fire questions that the emailer asked was, what options do those 4 moldy owners have if their strata council doesn't reimburse them for the repairs? This sounds like a trip to the court to me.
It would be, yes, and it could potentially be an expensive trip because, as Tony has pointed out, mold remediation is actually quite expensive.
Right.
The people who are doing the work show up in hazmat suits. It looks like something from a science fiction film.
Right.
The materials have to be handled in a certain way, and that adds cost to this type of repairs, which can easily exceed, say, for a small attic, $10,000, $20,000.
Right.
So if the total cost of repairs is below $25,000, looking at something like small claims might be an option. But if it's excess of that, or if you're trying to get an order that the strata, an injunction that the strata do the repairs,
yes, yeah.
Then you're looking at Supreme Court.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, and either way, we're talking some considerable expense here, and not an inconsiderable health risk that could potentially evolve out of all of this.
Yeah,
right?
Mold is one of those 4-letter words that no one likes to talk about in strata, and we did a lot of litigation back in the 90s and early 2000s around building envelope claims. One of the things I always tell people about mold is it's everywhere. The concern you have is what type of mold you've got in your attic, and it's always worthwhile when you do discover mold to have it tested. Those tests can cost, and not testing it yourself, but actually having an expert come in and test it.
Right.
They do specific types of tests, and they can tell you what's in the unit. They can also tell you whether the mold levels in your unit exceed the mold levels that are ambient in the air outside of your unit.
Sure.
Your refrigerator has mold in it.
Right.
It's all over the place.
Right.
So not all mold is dangerous, and people shouldn't have an immediate panic reaction to it.
Quickly, just before the break, how would this resolve? Would the strata insurance not cover the cost of the repairs necessarily?
No, the Strata insurance won't generally cover this type of thing because it's a maintenance-related item.
Even though it was a defect in the construction phase of the building.
But that's not what your insurance for. Your insurance is for perils, which are sudden losses.
Oh.
Right? And so it's not for maintenance or construction type items that may be defects in construction, defects in maintenance. That's not what your insurance covers for. The warranty program may cover for this, but even then the Strata Corporation may find that they might have to, if the warranty provider is not cooperating, they may have to remediate and commence an action against the warranty provider. Or they may have to force the warranty provider through mandatory mediation under the Homeowner Protection Act. There are a variety of methods to deal with, but Strata Council just needs to remember they have a responsibility to do this.
That's where they went off track, right up from the get-go. Hey, we're not responsible for that. Yes, you are.
Yeah.
He's Tony Giventu. I'm Sterling Fox. Our guest is Strata lawyer Paul Mendez. You're listening to Key Pacific's Talk About Strata on AM 650, and we'll be right back.
Delivering relevant and beneficial consumer information. This is Experts on Call, and there's more still ahead on AM 650.